I wasn't in a good place that winter. And I don't mean that in the polished way people say it when they've already come out the other side. I mean, I was 49 years old, bone tired, running on black coffee and habit, and living in my late parents' house because I had nowhere else in me to go. I had spent 26 years as a utility mechanic, the kind that keeps your lights on after windstorms and ice, the kind that crawls under panels with a flashlight in his teeth, and comes home smelling like wet canvas and transformer oil. Practical work, honest work, work with answers. A line is down or it isn't. A pump either primes or it doesn't. I trusted things that could be measured with a meter and tightened with a wrench. That had always been my framework, and for most of my life, it served me fine. Then grief came in layers and made my own house feel like a room I was renting by the night. My father had gone first. 2 years before I moved back, heart gave out in the barn aisle on a Wednesday morning. One moment he was carrying a bucket, next moment he was down on the concrete where he'd walked every day for 40 years. No speech, no warning, no final advice. Just done. My mother kept the place up another 18 months because she was stubborn in that calm way some people are, like weathered fence wire that bends and never snaps until one day it does. She had this ritual she never skipped. Every anniversary, she planted a pine sapling along the north field fence. 1 tree for each year she and Dad were married. She did it in gloves even in soft weather, tamped the roots by hand, watered twice, stepped back, nodded once, and went in to make supper. By the time she passed, she had 41 pines standing in 2 patient rows, growing into each other like a family that had learned how to weather storms together. Tree 42 never got planted. She had marked the spot with a stake and a strip of faded survey tape before the ground froze. She died before spring thaw. I took leave from the co-op the week after we buried her, then kept extending it until my supervisor, Nate, called and said, "Russ, I can keep your seat warm a little longer, but not forever. You need to tell me if you're coming back or done." I stood in the mudroom with the phone in one hand and my father's old barn keys in the other, turning them in my palm until the teeth bit my skin. "I'm not done," I told him. "I'm just slow right now." "You always were," he said, and I could hear the half smile in it. "Take 2 more weeks, then call me with a real answer." That was the whole conversation. No speeches, no pressure. 2 men who understood that most pain does not improve when talked at. By the first week of March, my days had narrowed into a routine so plain it almost disappeared. I woke before light because the house creaked less then. Less. I fed Patch, my old blue heeler with 1 bent ear and a white blaze down his nose. I checked the stock tank heater, walked the fence line where elk had leaned through, knocked ice from the lower trough, and made notes I didn't need in a spiral pad I carried everywhere. At noon, I ate whatever was easiest to heat. In the afternoon, I cleared brush from the drawer, patched drip lines, split cedar. At dusk, I checked irrigation valves out of habit, even though there wasn't much to irrigate yet. Then I sat on the porch steps with Patch pressed against my shin and watched the ridge lose colour. There are people who call that healing. To me, it felt like maintenance. Patch made it bearable without trying. He was 12, smart as a tax auditor and bossy about everything except grief, where he gave me a kind of room no person had managed. He'd follow me 3 steps behind when I wanted quiet, then wedge his head under my hand when I drifted too long. One evening I was so turned around I spent 5 minutes arguing with a fence post I thought was the gate latch, and when I finally realized what I was doing, Patch gave me a look that said he had concerns about my management. I laughed hard enough to cough, and for about 30 seconds, I felt like myself again. Evenings were the rough part. The cedar ridges north of our place cast long shadows that reached the porch early, and once that shade crossed the yard, I could feel the day closing in. I'd check the irrigation lines one more time, although they didn't need it, because walking had become easier than thinking. Then I'd sit with my elbows on my knees and stare toward the grove my mother planted. I could look at the first rows fine. I could even count through the trees if I kept my eyes moving. What I couldn't do was hold my gaze on the empty place where 42 should have been. It wasn't dramatic. It was worse than that. It was ordinary absence repeating itself every night. I'd spent half my life mocking local ridge stories at the diner in town. Old-timers talked about tracks by the upper logging road, stacks of stones where nobody stacked stones, a tall figure glimpsed near the cedar breaks at dawn. I called it weather, plus boredom. Give folks enough fog and too much coffee, they'll see history itself walking around, I said once, loud enough for 3 tables to hear. People laughed, including me. I liked being the grounded one. I liked being the man who could find the bad relay in a storm while everyone else guessed. Belief, in my book, belonged to church and little kids and people selling books at county fairs. On a Tuesday, I drove into town for feed and hydraulic fluid and ran into Mel Haskins outside the hardware store. Mel had known my parents since before I was born, thin as baling twine, eyes that missed nothing. "You settling in up there?" he asked. "Settling implies comfort," I said. "I'm functioning." He nodded like that was an acceptable answer. "Your mother always said trees make people stay honest. Hard to lie to something that outlives you." I shifted the feed bag from one hip to the other. "She said a lot of things that sounded mystical till you did the math." Mel grinned. "That's your problem, Russ. You think numbers and mystery can't share a fence line." I snorted and told him I had to go before Patch mutinied in the truck. He laughed. I drove home. Conversation over. But his words stuck around longer than I liked, hanging in the cab with the smell of grain and wet rubber all the way back up the county road. The homestead sat in the shadow of the cedar ridges, with the house on a slight rise and the barn lower, where spring runoff cut a shallow draw before joining Miller Creek. In summer, you could hear the creek most nights, soft and regular, like someone shuffling cards in another room. In late winter, it ran colder and louder, bumping broken ice against the bank with a hollow clack. I'd grown up with that sound. After my parents were gone, it changed character. Same water, same stones, but now it seemed to be counting something I didn't want counted. Some nights I walked down to the grove with a flashlight and stood at the edge without stepping in. 41 trunks, each one a year of their marriage made visible. The older pines were thick enough to shoulder wind. The younger ones still flexed in a hard gust. My mother had spaced them with care. Enough room for roots, enough room for light, a path between rows for mowing, and, later, memory. The stake for 42 still leaned where she left it. Tape faded to a washed-out pink that fluttered whenever the ridge wind came through. I told myself I'd plant that tree when the ground softened. I told myself that at least twice a week. Then I found another chore and put it off. I kept thinking grief would peak and taper, like a flood hydrograph you could chart, but mine came in pockets. Fine all morning, then flattened by a smell. Fine during chores, then blindsided by the shape of my father's cap, still hanging on the nail by the mudroom door. Fine while talking to Nate on the phone about parts inventory, then quiet for 10 minutes after we hung up, because he'd said, "Take care of yourself." And I didn't know what that meant in practical terms. Eat, sleep, keep moving. None of it touched the central fact that the 2 people who made that place home were gone. And I was the leftover piece trying to pretend that maintenance was the same thing as living. One evening, rain started around supper and kept on steady through dark. I made chili I didn't taste, watched Patch circle 3 times and drop on his blanket, and stood at the kitchen sink with both hands on the counter, listening to water tick off the gutter. There was a point somewhere after 9 when the house settled and the rain eased, and I caught my own reflection in the black window over the sink. I looked older than I had any memory of becoming. Shoulders rounded, jaw set like I was bracing for a blow that had already landed. I remember thinking, plain as a note written on a work order, this is what my life is now if I let it be. Chores, silence, avoidance. Repeat. I turned off the light, stepped onto the porch, and let the cold air hit my face. Patch came out and sat beside me without being asked. Down in the dark, beyond the yard, the line of pines was just a deeper black against the field, and I could pick out the gap where 42 belonged even in low light. I stood there long enough for my fingers to go numb, then went back in and set my boots by the door for morning. I didn't know what would change. I only knew something had to, because a man can't keep circling the same hurt forever and call it duty. I stood in the mudroom for a minute after that thought, one hand on the doorframe, listening to the refrigerator hum and the old clock above the calendar click off, seconds like it had all the authority in the world. Then I picked up Patch's leash, even though he didn't need one, pulled my coat back on and went out again because movement was the one thing that kept the dark from settling directly on my chest. The rain had quit, but the night held onto damp the way wool holds onto smoke. My boots sank a little in the yard. Water dripped from the eaves in an uneven rhythm. Patch trotted out, looked back to check I was following, then headed toward the barn lane with that practical little shoulder roll healers have when they're pretending they're not hurting you. I followed the fence first, then cut across the field where the grass lay flat and shining under the porch light spill. Beyond that, the pines stood in 2 lines, black against black, and the gap at the end seemed sharper in darkness than it did by day. I didn't step into the rows. I stopped where my mother used to stop with her watering can and gloves, and I let the wet cold soak through my cuffs while I stared at that stake with the faded tape twitching in the breeze. I had told myself I needed a clear day and thawed ground and the right size nursery pot. I had told myself I should do it on their anniversary, not some random weeknight in March. I had told myself a lot of things that sounded responsible and turned out to be avoidance with better grammar. Patch came back and leaned against my shin. I scratched his neck and said, "Don't start judging me now. I'm already outnumbered in this conversation." He sneezed, then sat down hard enough to splash my pant leg, which felt like a fair reply. I stayed there long enough that my fingers stung, and somewhere in that stinging, I could feel the shape of what I'd been dodging. The crux was plain. If I planted 42, I had to admit I was the one carrying it now. No more waiting for spring as an abstract season. No more pretending grief was a scheduling issue. I wanted relief, but I wanted instruction even more, and grief doesn't give instructions. It gives weather. Back at the house, I kicked my boots off, towed a towel under the door where the draft came in, and lay down fully dressed on top of the blankets. I slept in short bursts, woke twice thinking I heard my father close the barn gate, and each time it was only wind against the shed siding. By dawn I gave up and got up, and the morning routine carried me same as always. Feed scoop, water check, tank heater running. Fence corner by the cottonwood still sagging 2 inches at the post. Patch circling ahead and doubling back. The sky was a dull pewter sheet with brighter seam lines in the east where the sun tried to get under it. The cedar ridges held a low fog in their folds, thin and layered, and the drawer smelled like wet needles and cold mud. I wrote notes in my spiral pad I could have recited from memory. South trough valve stiff. North gate hinge needs grease. Order mineral block by Friday. By mid-morning, my shoulders had eased into work rhythm, and for a while the grief sat farther back. Not gone, just quieter. That's how most of that season was. You got a little room, then it closed again. I split cedar behind the shed, stacked it under tarp, and watched my breath lift in small bursts while the maul rang off the block with a clean crack that reminded me why I'd always preferred tools over talk. A bad split tells you exactly what happened. Grain twist, wrong angle, too much haste. Human hurt is more nuanced and less obedient. Around noon, I heated leftover chili and ate standing at the counter. Patch positioned himself with the moral confidence of a creature who believed all leftovers were a joint, legal enterprise. I gave him a spoonful and told him, "You keep this up, you're going to be 80% beans by summer." He accepted that as praise. After lunch, I took the long way to the creek, checking the culvert and the first run of irrigation line where it crossed the lower pasture. Meltwater had started under the crust. Not enough to worry me yet, but enough to make the ground sweat. The current sounded fuller than it had the week before, more weight in it, more push against the bend by the alder stand. I crouched, touched the water, and jerked my hand back at the cold. Patch paced the bank, nose low, then glanced uphill toward the grove, and waited like he expected me to follow. I did, but slowly. The field rose gradual from the creek to the north fence, and from that slope you could see the house, the barn roof, and both rows of pines in one frame if you stood in the right spot. I stopped there and looked until my eyes watered from wind. 41 trunks, one marked gap. A life measured not in speeches, but in years, repeated on purpose. I had spent 2 years treating that last empty place like a wound I could keep clean by not touching it. That afternoon, with my boots wet and my hands cracked from cold, it hit me that I had turned my parents' ritual into a museum display because museums don't ask anything back. I sat on an old stump near the fence and rested my elbows on my knees. Patch lay down at my feet and sighed like he'd finally gotten me to sit still. The ridgewind moved through the older pines first, then the younger, so the sound came in a soft stagger like a wave crossing 2 shorelines. That sound had been in my life longer than any job title I'd ever held. For a few minutes I could almost believe continuity was enough on its own. Then the low mood rolled in again, quick and total. Not dramatic, just heavy. I remember staring at my gloves and thinking, I'm so tired of carrying this alone. And I remember answering myself the way I always did. Keep moving, keep feeding things, keep fixing what breaks. It was a good ethic for machinery. It was a thin one for a man. By late afternoon, the sky lowered. Light went flat. I finished at the woodshed and did one more pointless loop of the irrigation valves, because routine was easier than deciding what mattered. Supper was eggs and toast. Patch got his kibble and looked personally betrayed by the absence of bacon. I washed dishes, set my boots by the door again, and stepped onto the porch with a mug of coffee, gone mostly cold. The field below held that washed-out blue-grey you get right before full dark. I could see the pine rows as a line of vertical shadows, steady and ordinary, and for once, I didn't look away from the gap. I held it. I let it hurt. I said out loud, though nobody was there to hear it, I'm going to plant it soon. Patch thumped his tail once against the boards, as if approving the paperwork. Night went quiet after that, and I slept harder than I had in weeks. No dreams I remembered, no false barn sounds, just dark, then morning. I woke before the alarm to a silence that registered even before I opened my eyes. Houses have normal sounds. So do mornings, furnace kick, gutter drip, jay squabble, the far-off rattle of a cattle trailer on County Road. That day had none of it. The stillness wasn't eerie exactly. It was non-trivial, the kind that makes you pause with one arm in your coat because your body notices pattern breaks faster than your mind does. Patch noticed first. He stood at the mudroom door, ears up, not tense, just attentive, and gave a low huff through his nose like he'd caught a scent he recognized. I poured feed, filled his bowl, and he ignored both, which in 12 years had happened approximately never. He looked at me, then at the door. "All right," I said. "You're in charge." The air outside was cold enough to bite, but dead calm. No branch tick, no wire hum. Fog sat low over the lower pasture, and the cedar ridge looked farther away than usual, edges softened. I followed Patch across the yard and through the wet grass, my boots making that hollow pull sound in mud, until we topped the slight rise by the grove. I stopped so hard I felt it in my knees. At the end of the row, in the exact spot marked by my mother's stake, stood a new pine sapling, about chest high, straight, fresh earth mounded clean around the base, dark and damp, tamped in a broad ring. The survey tape was gone. The stake lay neatly set aside, parallel to the fence like someone had respected it enough not to throw it. For a few seconds, I did the mechanical part of my brain on reflex. Nursery tag? None. Root ball shape? Handset, not machine augured. Soil source? Same loam as field edge mixed with creek sand. Then I saw the impressions around it, and the rest of me went quiet. Handprints, not boot prints, not shovel marks. 4 deep palm impressions in the wet dirt, each one wider than my spread hand by a fair margin, fingers long, pads distinct, pressed with careful pressure around the roots like someone had knelt and worked slow. There were no drag marks, no rut from a wheelbarrow, no sign of somebody tearing up ground in a hurry. Just that newly set tree and the patient evidence of strength used gently. Patch walked straight to it, circled once, and sat down beside the sapling with his chest against the mound like he was standing watch. Then he looked out toward the alder edge, thumped his tail twice, and settled in. I actually apologized out loud to a tree for stepping on the fresh dirt. "Sorry, Mom," I said. And then, because my brain was trying to protect itself with stupidity, I added, "Didn't mean to crowd your root zone." If anyone had filmed me, I would have denied knowing that man. I crouched by the mound and held my hand over one of the impressions without touching it. The scale was wrong for anything I had a ready category for. The finish was wrong too. No claw tears, no gouging, none of the damage you get when force meets mud. Whoever had done it had placed those hands like a person setting a sleeping child down. I told myself this couldn't be real in any framework I trusted. I told myself maybe Mel had hired somebody. I told myself maybe I had somehow missed a volunteer pine and invented the rest. Evidence suggests the mind will reach for ordinary explanations first, and mine did, hard. Patch broke that loop by leaning his shoulder into my side and giving a soft whine, not anxious, almost pleased. He kept looking toward the trees, then back at me, then at the sapling, like he was introducing 2 parties that ought to get along. In the pasture below us, a doe stepped out of the fog with a late fawn at her flank, both of them calm as fence posts. They grazed within easy sight of the grove, and never once gave a start. I stayed kneeling in that cold mud a long time, my palm hovering over a print too large to argue with. My dog sitting guard beside a tree my mother never got to plant and somebody else had finished for her. My skepticism and my longing met right there in the wet ground, and neither one won. I just breathed, listened to that great morning hush, and understood that whatever had crossed my fence line had not come to take. It had come to tend. I stayed there another minute with my knees in the mud, trying to slow my breathing so I could notice details instead of getting carried by feeling. The damp earth smelled like creek sand and pine pitch. My fingertips went numb in my gloves. Patch stayed planted beside that little tree, like he'd been assigned and meant to do the job right. Then the work part of me kicked in. I stood up, backed out without stepping in the ring around the roots, and walked to the shed at a pace that felt controlled until I realized I was nearly jogging. I came back with my spiral pad, a tape measure, and my old phone. I took pictures from 4 angles. I measured one palm impression at just over 11 inches across at the widest point, and almost 13 from heel to fingertip. I wrote it down twice because the first time looked like I'd misread my own tape. I checked the soil around the mound for boot tread, tire marks, drag lines, anything that fit an ordinary explanation. Nothing. Just shallow depressions where something heavy had shifted weight carefully, and a narrow trail of disturbed grass leading toward the alder edge above Miller Creek. I didn't follow it yet. I just stood with my pencil against the pad and listened. The hush had started to loosen by then. A jay called once from the south fence, sharp and offended, like it was reclaiming the morning. Wind moved through the top of the older pines. Somewhere down by the road, a truck shifted gears. Regular sounds returning should have steadied me, but the non-trivial part had already happened, and my whole framework was trying to stretch around it without tearing. Patch finally got up, sniffed the mound one last time, and trotted a loose circle around me. He nudged my hand like he does when he thinks I'm overthinking on company time. I scratched his shoulder and said, "You got opinions, don't you?" He gave me that sideways look healers use when they've already made a decision for you. I checked the rest of the morning chores with the pad still under my arm, and that was how I knew curiosity had edged grief out for the first time in months. Not healed, not gone, just shifted to the back seat while my mind worked a new problem. At the lower trough, I caught myself scanning mud for prints before I checked the float valve. At the woodshed, I opened the side door and stopped. The split cedar I'd left in a rough heap the day before was stacked chest-high in 3 clean columns. Heartwood, sapwood, and kindling sticks bundled by size. Tight, square, dry side out under the eave line where weather couldn't reach. I stood there with my keys in my hand, turning them like I did on the phone with Nate, and laughed once under my breath because there was no graceful response to your firewood being organized better than you organized it yourself. "I'm getting shown up on my own property," I told Patch. He sniffed the stack, then sat down and leaned against my leg, satisfied as a foreman after inspection. I walked the perimeter again, slower. At the new sapling, I found 4 flat river stones crossed in pairs around the mound, not touching the trunk, set where wind usually cut hardest from the north side. It wasn't decoration, it was function. A windbreak and heat sink, exactly where I would have placed them if I'd thought to. I crouched, touched one stone with 2 fingers, and found it still damp from creek water. I ran through explanations in order, same as I would on a fault call. Neighbor prank, volunteer labor, somebody trespassing with odd habits, me missing obvious signs because grief had narrowed my vision. Each one failed at a different point. Neighbors around us didn't cross fences without calling first. Nobody hauled creek stones uphill before dawn for a joke that had no audience. And nobody I knew, nobody, made hand impressions that size and then set things with that much care. By late morning, I called Mel Haskins from the porch, because if anyone had seen trucks on the back road, it'd be him. He picked up on the second ring. "Russell Jordan calling before lunch. Either civilization has ended or you need a part number." "I need neither. You had anyone up near my fence line this week?" "Not me. Why?" I looked out at the grove while I answered. Somebody planted a pine in my mother's marked spot. Also stacked my cedar like they were grading me. A pause. Then his voice got softer, not teasing. "You serious?" "Measured prints and everything. No boots, no tire tracks." He let out a breath I could hear through the line. I'll say this once and then I'll shut up. Don't go stomping around trying to corner whatever did you a kindness. Let it be what it is. That's not exactly practical advice. Neither is arguing with evidence because it arrived in the wrong shape. I rubbed my thumb along the porch rail, worn smooth where my father used to stand. You telling me you believe the old stories? I'm telling you I've lived long enough to quit pretending I've met all my neighbors. We sat in silence a beat. Then he said, You eat yet? Not yet. Eat, keep notes, call me if something turns rough. Nothing about this feels rough, I said, and heard the truth of it after it left my mouth. Then pay attention, he said, and hung up. I made a sandwich I barely tasted and took it to the back step. Patch got his legal share. Clouds lifted enough to show thin sunlight over the cedar ridge, and the grove changed colour, dark trunks warming to a muted green at the tips. I watched that 40-second sapling sway once in the breeze and settle. The stake my mother had used still lay parallel to the fence. Whoever planted the tree had moved it, not discarded it. That detail stayed with me more than the print size did. Respect has a texture. So does hurry. This had one and not the other. After lunch, I followed the disturbed grass line towards the alders. The ground there held water and kept impressions better than pasture. Every 20 feet or so, I found partial tracks in the soft spots. Deep, broad, long-strided, but placed at the edges of firmer patches, as if avoiding churn. No broken saplings, no torn bark, no sign of careless force. At one turn in the trail, a low branch had been lifted and laid aside so it wouldn't whip back. I stopped and stared at that for a while because it was such a small courtesy, and because grief had trained me to expect roughness from the world, not consideration. 100 yards down slope near the draw where runoff started cutting channels each thaw, I found fresh scraping in the silt. 2 narrow trenches had been cleared of leaves and branch litter, angled to carry overflow away from the grove's lower edge and back toward a rocky spill where the bank could take it. I'd meant to do that before spring surge. I hadn't. The channels were clean enough to look machine-cut, except no machine had been there. I stood over them with my hands on my hips and said out loud, All right, whoever you are, your maintenance standards are aggressive. Patch barked once, short and bright, then bounded ahead and back like he was delighted I'd finally joined the right meeting. That afternoon passed in a strange, steady focus. I repaired 2 fence staples, greased the north gate hinge, and checked the creek rise with a stick marker at the bend. But each task had a second layer now. I was looking for pattern, for intention, for the shape of a presence that stayed just outside direct sight and kept leaving useful work behind. Grief wasn't gone. It was there like an old ache in cold weather, but curiosity had given me enough room to stand upright inside it. By the 3rd evening after the sapling appeared, the forecast on the radio started using the phrase, Black Thaw again, same as folks did when warm rain hit old snowpack and sent every draw in the county running hard at once. I wrote it in the pad, underlined twice, and walked down near dusk to check the grove edge before dark. Light in that hour goes layered around here, gold at the top of the ridge, blue in the shadows, silver where wet bark catches what's left. The alders by Miller Creek held a thin mist, and the air carried that mixed scent of thawing earth, cedar oil, and cold water on stone. Patch moved ahead of me but not far, stopping every so often to look back, ears relaxed. No tension in him, no bristle along his spine, just alert and calm. I stepped between the last 2 older pines and froze, not from fear, from focus. Across the draw, maybe 40 yards out through the alder trunks, a shape moved where there should have been only brush. Tall enough that its shoulders crossed the line of a low-hanging limb I had to duck under, broad through the chest. Dark fur, rain dulled, blending and then separating from shadow as it turned. It held a downed branch in both hands. Not snapped loose in anger, just carried. One end lifted so it wouldn't drag and scar the saplings below. I knew in that first clear look that I was seeing what my measurements had already told me. 8 feet, maybe more, built with a kind of massive balance that should have looked clumsy, and didn't. It stepped over a mossed log, placed the branch beside the 40-second sapling at an angle that would break wind from the draw, and adjusted it twice until it sat stable. Deliberate, economical, gentle in a way that made no sense at that scale, and yet was right in front of me. Every training from my practical life said, categorize, respond, control the scene. None of that applied. I wanted to run and to stay at the same time. I told myself this couldn't be real, then watched it turn its head slightly and look directly at me with amber-brown eyes that held no charge in them, no challenge, no panic, just attention, presence, meeting, presence. Patch walked 3 paces forward, then lay down between us with his front paws crossed, like this was a porch visit and manners mattered. Down near the fence, the same doe I'd seen before stepped into view with her fawn, grazing easy, tail still. Birds shifted in the cedar tops and kept singing. No alarm pattern in the woods, no scatter, no break. The whole scene carried a prevailing consensus I could feel in my bones before I could name it. This was not a threat display. This was coexistence offered plain. I don't know how long we stayed there. Not long by the clock, maybe. Long enough for my breathing to match the sway of branches. Long enough for my shoulders to drop. The creature didn't advance, didn't retreat. It stood in open view and let me witness what it had done. Then it lowered one hand, palm open toward the ground for a beat, almost like showing it was empty, and stepped back into the alders with the same careful placement I'd seen in the tracks. No crash through brush. No dramatic vanishing, just 3 measured steps, shadow taking shape back from sight, and then only mist between trunks. I realized I had tears on my face and hadn't noticed them start. Patch got up, shook once, and came back to press against my knee. I put my hand on his head and stared at the branch now set by the sapling, at the crossed stones, at the ring of tamped earth around the tree my mother never got to plant. The world had not become smaller or easier in that moment. It had become larger and, somehow, kinder than the framework I'd been living in. When the light finally dropped enough that the grove turned to silhouettes, I backed out the way I came, careful where I put my boots. At the porch, I cleaned mud from my soles, fed Patch, and sat with my spiral pad open on the table. I wrote down every detail while it was fresh. Distance, posture, hand movement, branch placement, animal behavior, my own pulse settling instead of spiking. Then I closed the pad and set my father's keys on top of it, both objects quiet in lamplight, both real in my hand. That night, for the first time since I moved back, I looked straight at the grove from the kitchen window before turning out the light, and I didn't look away. I kept standing at that window until the glass cooled my forehead, and Patch gave a soft huff behind me, like he was reminding me that awe still needed sleep. I shut off the kitchen light, checked the latch out of habit, and sat on the edge of my bed with my boots still on because part of me expected the whole thing to fold back into ordinary if I looked away too long. It didn't. The notes in my pad were still there on the table. The branch by the sapling was still there in my mind, placed with more care than most people give their own fences. I lay down finally, fully awake in the dark, and listened to the house settle. No fear came with it, just a deep, uneasy tenderness, like finding a handrail in a stairwell you thought ended in a drop. Sometime in the middle of the night I got up again, pulled on my coat, and stepped onto the porch without turning on the yard light. clouds had thinned, and the field held a pale wash of moonlight that made the pine rows look silver-edged. Patch followed, pressed into my leg, and stood alert, but easy. Down near the grove I heard one heavy step in wet grass, then another, spaced slow and even, not sneaking and not announcing itself either. A tall shape moved along the north side of the row, partly screened by trunks, and bent at the waist with a smooth, controlled motion that still didn't seem like it should belong to something that large. It lifted a split section of cedar from where I'd left a rough pile that afternoon and carried it to the draw edge, setting it where Washout had been eating at the bank. Then another, then another. I stayed on the porch and watched, because crowding the moment felt wrong. After the fourth piece, it paused, turned its head toward the house, and held still long enough that I knew it had seen me the whole time. No startle, no retreat, no warning posture, just recognition, clear as a handshake. Then it returned to the work, like my being there changed nothing essential. I stood with one hand on the porch post and felt my old framework arguing with what my eyes were taking in. I told myself this couldn't be real in any category I had lived by. I told myself fatigue can bend perception, grief can invent comfort, moonlight can lie. Then it lifted another cedar section one-handed, walked it 20 yards through slick ground without breaking stride, and set it down so gently the mud barely splashed. Hallucinations don't improve drainage. I remember laughing once under my breath at the sheer absurdity of my own resistance. I had spent decades diagnosing systems under pressure, and here I was, being handed repeatable evidence by a neighbor bigger than my pickup and kinder than half the men I'd worked storms with. Patch sat down on my boot and thumped his tail like he'd settled the question an hour ago. By dawn, the clouds had shut again, and a fine cold rain had started, the kind that threads through jacket seams and makes every hinge in the place sound older. I took coffee and a thermos lid down to the grove and checked the cedar placements in full light. They weren't random. They formed a staggered line above the weakest cut in the bank, each piece angled to catch debris and slow sheet flow before it reached the saplings. Whoever laid them understood water. I crouched and traced the line with my eyes to the two narrow channels I'd found before. They had been widened overnight and cleared deeper to mineral soil. No shovel marks, just broad scrape patterns and hand-set stones locking the edges. For 30 straight seconds I forgot to drink my coffee and held the lid like a fool while rain filled it. "You're doing great, Russ," I told myself. Hydration by weather event. That was about as much humor as I had, but it steadied me. I called Nate after breakfast because I needed one conversation from my old life to hear how I sounded in it. He answered over engine noise. "You coming in Monday or what?" "I'm coming in for 2 days next week," I said. "Need to keep benefits straight. I can do line checks and inventory." "That works, you sound better." I watched Patch through the kitchen window, nose to the ground near the porch steps where a large wet print had half formed and blurred in drizzle. "Better isn't the word. Different, maybe." Nate was quiet, then said, "Different can be useful. You need anything?" "Yeah. If you've got spare survey flags and erosion mesh headed for discard, set it aside. I'll pick it up. For your place? For the grove." "Done," he said. "Take what you need." By that afternoon, every forecast used the same warning language about warm rain hitting old ridge snow and driving a hard surge through Miller Creek. And folks around here didn't need a meteorologist to know what black thaw could do to an unprotected bank. I spent that afternoon hauling fieldstone in the tractor bucket from the dry pile by the barn, then carrying it by hand where machinery couldn't go. Patch ranged ahead and back, stopping now and then to look into the alders and then at me, as if checking whether I had noticed what he had. I had. I found fresh tracks beside the draw by noon, deep but precise, each placement on firmer ground between slick patches. The underlying message had become impossible to misread. This was preparation, not performance. Near dusk, the rain eased to mist, and I took one more load of stones down alone because I wanted the lower bend reinforced before dark. The grove looked almost luminous in that weather, trunks rising out of fog, new tips bright against a dull sky. I set my bucket down at the 42nd sapling and heard a measured movement behind me from the older side. When I turned, he was there in plain view at maybe 30 yards, taller than the fence line posts by a full head, and then some, fur dark with rain, shoulders broad enough to make nearby trunks look thin. He held a long deadfall limb under one arm and a clump of root-woven sod in the other hand. He stopped when I stopped, amber-brown eyes calm and level, fixed on me with the same unhurried attention as before. I raised both hands, palms out, empty. "Evening," I said, my voice rougher than I meant. "Bank crews short-handed tonight." He angled his head slightly, then moved, not toward me but toward the draw cut where water had been biting hardest. He laid the limb into the cedar line at a diagonal and pressed the sod against the upstream side to seal a gap. Then he stepped back and looked from the gap to my stone pile, then to me. The gesture was so practical it stripped all drama out of the moment. He wasn't displaying strength. He was asking for material. I picked up a flat rock the size of a dinner plate, walked it halfway, and set it where his gaze had paused. He watched my hands, then nodded once, small, unmistakable, and set a larger stone against mine with 2 fingers, and his thumb like it weighed no more than a loaf of bread. Patch trotted between us, shook rain from his coat, and parked himself beside the sapling like a site supervisor refusing to pick sides. What followed felt less like an encounter, and more like shared labor under weather pressure, wordless and exact. He would identify a weak point with an open hand, never jabbing, never crowding. I would carry stone, wedge brush, tamp mud. He brought deadfall lengths from the older edge and placed them into a staggered crib that redirected flow away from the root line of trees, 38 through 42. When he needed me closer, he stepped back first, leaving clear space and waiting until I moved on my own. Once, at the narrowest part of the cut, I slipped on clay and dropped to a knee. He stopped instantly and held where he was, shoulders lowered, giving me room to recover. No rush, no looming. Just patience so complete it settled my nerves faster than any reassurance could have. Rain thickened again near full dark and drummed on jacket hoods, on pine needles, on the new little berm we were building one deliberate piece at a time. Water started to thread through the upper channel, and I saw it catch, slow, split, and slide toward the rocky spill instead of charging the sapling base. He watched that first diverted run with me, then turned to the 42nd tree. With both hands he pressed the soil ring lightly, checking firmness all the way around, as careful as any gardener. He lifted one of the crossed river stones, rotated it a few inches for better shelter from north wind, and set it down with a precision that made me think of my mother, kneeling in her gloves, tamping roots and stepping back to inspect her line. Something gave way in me right then, not in a dramatic break, but in a clean release, like a valve finally opening after months of pressure. I had carried grief as a private assignment, convinced duty meant doing it alone. Standing in sleet with mud to my shins, passing stones to a silent giant who treated my mother's ritual as worth protecting, I felt accompanied inside that loss for the first time. Tears came hard and hot despite the rain. I didn't hide them. There was no point. Patch leaned his shoulder against my calf and stayed there. I wiped my face with a wet glove and laughed once at myself. "You show up for one drainage job and turn into a puddle," I said quietly. He stood a few paces off, chest rising slow, eyes steady on mine until my breathing settled. Then he touched the trunk of the 40-second sapling with his fingertips. Brief, gentle contact. Looked to the berm, looked back at me, and gave that same small nod as if to mark the work complete for the night. He turned toward the alders, moved through the mist in 3 long, careful strides, and disappeared by degrees between wet trunks and low fog, never hurrying and never looking back. I stayed until the light was almost gone, checking each joint in the crib line, each stone seat, each channel outlet, because practical habits run deep and because I wanted the record in my hands as much as in my heart. The structure held under steady runoff. The sapling stood straight. The older pines swayed and settled, their roots protected by a barrier built from cedar, stone, and a kind of deliberate kindness I still did not know how to classify, except by its results. At the house, I stripped off soaked layers, fed Patch extra, and spread my spiral pad open at the table. I logged every detail: materials, angles, flow behavior, his gestures, my responses, the time Rain intensified, where the first diversion succeeded. Then I wrote one line by itself under all the measurements. He was not afraid of me either, and he helped me keep what I love. I sat there with the pen still in my hand until the ink dried on the tip, and skipped when I tried to add one more note. Rain tapped harder against the kitchen window, then turned from tapping to a steady drumming that blurred the yard light into a soft yellow smear. Patch had finished his food and curled under the table, but every few minutes he lifted his head toward the back door and listened. I could feel the same pull in my own chest. Not fear, not exactly. Urgency with direction. The kind you get when a transformer starts whining before it blows, and you know waiting is just denial in cleaner clothes. I capped the pen, slid the spiral pad into a gallon freezer bag, and set it by the door with my gloves and headlamp. Then I poured fresh coffee into a thermos and stood at the sink, watching water stream off the gutter corner closest to the grove. The downspout was already running full. By 10:30, the creek marker at the bend had climbed 6 inches. I checked it with my headlamp and came back soaked from the knees down, rain needling through my jacket seams in cold lines. The drawer was no longer shuffling cards in another room. It was speaking up, fast and heavy, with that deep rolling sound of runoff pushing limbs and old ice together. I called Mel from the mudroom while I changed gloves. He answered on the 4th ring, voice thick with sleep. "You all right?" "Water's rising quick," I said. "Faster than forecast." A pause, then blankets rustling. "You stay clear of the main cut. Don't play hero." "I won't, just letting you know." "Call me at first light." "I will." He exhaled once. "Russ?" "Yeah?" "Trust what you've seen." The line clicked dead. Outcome delivered. No speeches. I put the phone in a dry pocket, clipped on my old radio out of habit even though I had nobody to call on it, and whistled Patch to the door. He was up before I finished the breath. The walk to the grove felt longer in dark rain than it did in daylight. Every dip in the field full of cold water over my boot tops. Every fence post a shape I had to verify twice in the headlamp beam. When I topped the rise, I shut the lamp off on instinct and let my eyes adjust. Moonlight leaked through torn clouds in thin silver sheets, enough to read the ground if I stood still. The berm line we'd built held for the moment, but runoff had found a fresh path above tree 39 and was cutting a narrow channel that pointed straight toward the new sapling. I took 3 steps down the slope, and a darker shape separated from the alder shadows to my left. He was already there, bent over a deadfall trunk as thick as my thigh, one hand under it near center balance, the other guiding the butt end so it didn't plow through the younger roots. He set it into the upstream side of the crib at a shallow angle, tested it with a push, then looked at the cut where water was biting through. Open hand, 2 slow motions, here then lower. Instruction as clear as any line diagram I'd ever read. "Got it," I said, and my voice came out raw. I hauled flat stones from the pile we'd staged at dusk, wedging them where his hand had paused. He brought brush mats, root wads, one more cedar section. We worked in a rhythm that made room for both of us. He never crowded my side of the channel. When I moved in, he shifted back. When I slipped, he stopped and waited. The rain kept coming, cold enough to sting my ears. But inside that rhythm, I quit noticing it except as weight on my shoulders. Around midnight, the first real surge hit. You could hear it before it rounded the bend, a low shove that turned to white noise when it met the crib. Water jumped, fanned, found seams. One seam failed at the lower left and started chewing backward toward the roots of 41. I swore under my breath and dropped to my knees in mud, hands digging for a stone that wasn't there. He crossed behind me in 2 silent strides, planted his feet wide in the runoff, and lowered a long anchor log into place with both hands while holding his balance against current that would have knocked me flat. Not brute force. Leverage. Placement. He twisted the log 1/2 inch until it locked against 2 buried stumps, then pointed once to the pocket under it. I jammed 3 stones in, then a 4th. He pressed the top one gently with 2 fingers. Stable. That was when something in me opened all the way. It wasn't only the work. It was the fact that this was my parents' grove, and I wasn't standing in that weather alone trying to save what they built. I had been carrying that aloneness like a private oath for so long, it had become my personality. In the rain, on my knees in black mud, with Patch barking once from high ground and then quieting, I felt that oath dissolve. I put both hands on the wet earth by the 42nd sapling and cried so hard my breath broke between ribs. Not tidy tears. Full body grief finally finding an exit. "I miss them," I said aloud to nobody and to everyone. "I miss both of them. I don't know how to do this place without them." He stood 6 feet away in the rain and did nothing except remain there, shoulders lowered, gaze steady, giving me the one thing I hadn't been able to give myself: company without demand. Patch came down the slope, pressed his whole side against my arm, and leaned until I laughed and choked at the same time. "Yeah, buddy," I said, wiping my face with a muddy sleeve. "We're a mess tonight." The next hour was labor and breath and water noise. I stopped shaking. We kept building. He showed me where to move the crossed stones so wind and flow wouldn't undercut the sapling mound. I added brush to catch silt. He tamped the backfill with broad palms, in slow, even pressure so roots stayed covered and oxygen pockets remained. That detail told me more than any footprint ever could. He wasn't just blocking water, he was protecting life. By 2:30, rain eased from hard sheets to steady fall, and the creek level stopped climbing. The surge still pushed, but the berm no longer shuddered under each hit. Flow split at the crib, peeled away through the channels, and spilled into the rocky run exactly where we needed it. I checked 3 points twice, then a 3rd time because habits die stubborn. Same result each pass. Holding. I finally stood upright, back popping, gloves heavy with water, and looked down the 2 rows of pines. 41 older trees and 1 new sapling, all of them dark and slick under cloud-broken moonlight, all still standing. I realized I was breathing deep for the first time in months, not the shallow, guarded breathing I'd been living on. Deep enough to feel cold air all the way down. "Thank you," I said, and there was no clever version of it to hide behind. He turned from the channel and faced me fully. Up close in that light, his size was still staggering, but so was the care in the way he held himself. Weight balanced back so I had space, hands open and empty at his sides. He reached out and touched the trunk of the 40-second sapling with his fingertips, then touched his own chest once, light and brief, like marking a promise kept. After that, he lowered his hand and nodded. No flourish, no lingering for effect. By the grey edge of dawn, clouds thinned enough to show pale bands over the cedar ridge, and mist began lifting off the lower pasture in long, slow ribbons. Water still moved, but with less rage in it. The big work was done. He stepped backward once from the sapling, eyes on mine, then turned toward the alder line. Patch stood, tail low and easy, and watched him go without a sound. At the first screen of trunks, he paused and looked back one last time. Not dramatic, just a quiet check that I was steady on my feet. I was. He gave the smallest tilt of his head and walked on. 3 steps, then 5, then only motion in mist where branches swayed and settled. I didn't follow. The urge was there, strong and human, to ask for one more look, one more proof, one more moment to pin the mystery down so it couldn't slip away. But the underlying truth was clearer than that urge. This had never been about capture. It was about witness and care. I stayed at the grove and let the morning come. At first light, I called Mel like I said I would. He answered quick this time. "Well?" "Bank held," I said. "Every tree's still up." I heard him sit down hard on his end. "You sound different again." I looked at the 40-second sapling, rain beaded on its needles like glass. "I'm not sealed shut anymore." He was quiet for a few seconds, then soft, "Good." I ended the call, stowed the phone, and did a full walk of the site with my pad out, documenting everything while it was fresh. Crib dimensions, anchor points, channel depth, where the diversion started and where it rejoined the creek. I photographed the handprints that remained clear in sheltered mud and the ones half softened by rain. Physical evidence logged and bagged in my mind, if not in plastic. Prints, placement, outcomes. At the woodshed later, I set aside 3 of the flattest river stones we had used and marked their underside with the date in pencil before the moisture could lift it. Not for display, for record. When I finished, I stood at the edge of the grove with Patch against my knee and watched dawn colour move down the trunks, top to bottom, until the whole row shifted from grey to green. Grief was still there. It would be there tomorrow too. But it was no longer a locked room. It had windows now, and weather, and work to do, and the memory of a silent neighbour who had come in rain helped me save my parents' years, and left without asking for anything in return. I stood there until the sun cleared the ridge and turned the wet bark amber. Then I walked back to the house with Patch at my heel and did what I always did when something mattered. I made a record. I spread towels by the mudroom stove, peeled off soaked layers, and set the freezer bag with my spiral pad on the table beside my father's keys. I downloaded every photo from my phone to the old desktop in the den, then copied them to a thumb drive and labelled it with painter's tape. Grove, Black Thor, March. The 3 flat stones I had marked with date in pencil were still in my jacket pocket. I rinsed them in a basin, dried them, and set them on the windowsill above the sink where morning light hit first. Not trophies, reference points. Proof that a night had happened exactly as I remembered it. By Monday, I drove down to the co-op before daylight, coffee in a travel mug and erosion notes on the passenger seat. Nate had kept his word. A roll of mesh, 2 bundles of survey flags, and a box of staple pins were waiting by the bay door with my name on a scrap of cardboard, set aside by the night crew so I could load and go. I strapped everything down in the rain, climbed into the cab, and called him before I pulled out. "You sleeping any?" he asked. "Some," I said. "More than before?" A pause, then. "You still doing 2 days a week?" "Yeah, Tuesdays and Thursdays for now. Field checks, inventory, whatever keeps me useful." Useful was never your problem, Russ. Vanishing was. I watched wipers push brown water off the windshield and said, "I know." He asked if the mesh was for my creek bank. "Grove Bank," I told him. "Got hit hard. Held, but I'm not trusting one good night." Another pause. Then, "Bring pictures tomorrow. I've got a buddy in district conservation. He can tell you if your layout needs reinforcement." "I'll bring them." That was outcome enough for one morning. Seat at work, kept, supplies delivered, no loose ends. On Tuesday afternoon, I sat in the district office with a conservation tech named Luis, a man who smelled like wet wool and photocopier toner and had mud still drying on his boots. I slid printed photos across his desk: the staggered cedar crib, the anchor loglock, the channel angle, the protected root zone around trees 38 to 42. I left the handprint photos face down until the end, then put one on top and watched him take in the scale without comment. He tapped the berm layout with a pen. "Whoever set this understands flow energy. Stagger spacing is right. Good dissipation. I'd add mesh here and here to keep fines from washing out next surge." He circled 2 points. Then he looked at the print photo again. "You got big hands in your family." I could have laughed, but I didn't. "Not that big." He slid the photo back to me and kept his tone practical. "I'm not wildlife. If you want species identification, call fish and habitat. For bank stability, this structure works. You maintain it after heavy rain, it'll keep doing its job." Submitted and analyzed. That mattered to me. He wasn't grading belief. He was grading function. Function passed. That night, I called Fish and Habitat from the number on the county bulletin and filed a plain report. Unusual tracks, size measurements, location, no aggression, evidence of watershed work around Memorial Grove. 3 days passed before I heard from dispatch again, and when I did, the woman on the line sounded kind and tired at once. "Mr. Jordan, our biologist reviewed your measurements and photos. Most likely a black bear track distortion in saturated soil." "Black bears stack cedar by species now?" I asked before I could stop myself. A quiet pause. "I can only relay the official assessment." I looked out the kitchen window at 42 standing straight in evening light. "Understood. Log it as unresolved observer report then." "I can do that." Dismissive outcome noted. I thanked her and hung up without anger. I had spent my career inside official categories. I knew what happened when evidence didn't fit one. On Friday, I met Mel at the diner in town, same counter, same cracked vinyl booths, same waitress calling everybody hon whether they earned it or not. He listened while I told him the practical version. Bank held, Conservation Office approved the structure, Wildlife Office called it bear distortion. He stirred his coffee, eyes on the spoon. "That answer satisfy you?" he asked. "No," I said, "but it doesn't have to. The trees are still there." Mel set the spoon down and finally looked at me. "You remember when my north calves kept turning up by the old cedar break in storms? Folks said I was forgetting gates. I wasn't forgetting." He held my gaze a second longer. I never told that story full because I didn't need argument for supper conversation. But I found stacked brush windbreaks out there 3 winters straight, built at calf height, and prints bigger than dinner plates around them. No cattle were lost those years. He gave a small shrug. "That's all I know, and that's enough for me." Loaded look from a man who had paused his sentence years ago in public and never finished it. Now he finished it. Thread closed. By the second week of April, I had the mesh pinned in place, extra stone keyed into the lower seam, and fresh willow stakes driven above the diversion channel, so roots would bind the bank by summer. Patch supervised from whichever spot put him exactly in my way. One afternoon he stole a survey flag and paraded it around the grove like he'd won an election. I told him, if confidence paid taxes, you'd own this county. And he grinned that healer grin with the flag, hanging out one side. I laughed hard enough to sit down on the old stump and wipe my eyes. Grief was still in me, but laughter no longer felt like betrayal. On April 23rd, my parents' anniversary, I carried a new pine sapling from the truck bed to the end of the second row where tree 43 belonged. Morning was clear, ridge wind mild, soil dark from a light night rain. I wore my mother's old planting gloves, the leather soft and cracked at the fingers, and I set the root ball exactly the way she had taught me. Flare at grade, backfill in lifts, water, tamp, water again. Patch sat just outside the ring like he understood ceremony better than most people do. I kept my father's keys in my pocket the whole time, the metal warm from my hand. When the tree stood straight, I stepped back, nodded once without planning to, and laughed under my breath at myself for copying her, to the inch. Then I took one of the dated stones from the kitchen windowsill and set it at the edge of the woods where the alder path began. Not payment, not bait, just thanks in a language of objects and placement we both seemed to understand. That evening, after supper, I walked back down and found the stone moved 3 feet to the left, nested beside a second flat river stone I had not placed. Both of them angled toward the grove, like arrowheads pointing home. No fresh prints in the drier ground, no dramatic sign, just that small revision. I stood there with my hands in my jacket pockets and felt a calm settle over me that had weight and shape. He had not come for praise. He had not stayed for credit. He had answered care with care, then let silence hold the rest. I never got another full, open-view encounter after that spring. I noted that honestly because truth matters more than story symmetry. What I did get were continuations. A drainage notch cleared after the first hard summer storm. Split cedar restacked before an early freeze. Crossed stones reset around 42 after high wind. Each time I photographed, dated, and logged the change in the spiral pad that lived by my kitchen table with my father's keys on top. The pad is full now, and the freezer bag is worn cloudy at the folds. Evidence kept, not displayed. Mystery preserved, not chased. I went back to work steady by June. Still 2 days at first, then 3. Nate stopped asking whether I was coming back and started asking whether I could train the new kid on transformer diagnostics, which is workplace language for you're yourself again. At home, I kept the grove mowed between rows, checked the berm after every surge, and planted 1 pine each anniversary with the same gloves, the same nod, and Patch's patient company until he got old enough that he preferred the porch step for supervision. When his legs stiffened, I carried him down in my arms and set him in the grass by 42 so he could lean against my boot and watch. What changed was not that grief disappeared. A primary consideration is that grief never worked that way for me. What changed was the framework around it. I had lived like loss was a sealed room, and duty meant sitting inside it alone. After that winter, loss became a landscape I could tend, rows to water, banks to reinforce, anniversaries to mark, work to share when sharing appeared. The world remained unresolved in all the technical ways. I still could not name, classify, or explain every detail I measured, but I could no longer pretend kindness was rare just because it arrived without announcement. This morning, years later, I stood at the same kitchen window where I once saw only absence. There are more trees now, each one a year carried forward. 42 is tall enough to cast shade over the path at dusk. The berm still holds. The creek still counts in its own language. I keep a small bowl of flat river stones by the back door, and now and then I leave one at the alder edge before turning in for the night. Sometimes it is still there in the morning. Sometimes it is not. Either way, I feed the dog, check the lines, and go on with my day in peace, which is a thing I did not know I could have again until a silent neighbor stepped out of the cedar shadow and helped me keep my parents' forest standing.